Yo, 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 what is up, everyone? I'm donHaize, and today I'm going to be doing something a little bit more fun. I'm going to be doing a unit tier list for Dune Spice Wars. Today I've put about 108 hours into Dune Spice Wars. I've played the campaign on insane difficulty and completed that with all 5 factions. I have put a fair amount of time into both Fremen and Scavengers through the skirmish. Obviously, there is no campaign for those 2 factions, so I am a little more limited in my knowledge of those 2 factions. But I've put, let's say, quite a lot of time, probably about 95 hours into the campaign at this point, and feel like it's worth just going over what I think are the top tier units in this game, which ones are strong, which ones are weak, and sort of how to, I guess, build a composition around each of the factions. At least based on my own personal opinions and experience. So it is worth noting that I've only put the core units of each faction into this tier list. There wasn't actually a tier list for the Dune Spice Wars units, so I had to kind of create them myself using these cards. So I've done as best as I can to Photoshop these and put them into this tier maker engine. I will share the link should you want to create your own tier lists yourselves. But this should, act as at least a basic guide, I suppose. But yeah, I have purposely not included the guild units, including the sort of motherships, I suppose, for each faction. The Landsrad units, which are a little bit unique in that you don't always get them, and you kind of have to do the Landsrad charter to obtain them anyway. And obviously the Renegade units are also not part of this unit list. With that being said, folks, I'm going to be tiering these from S to D, S being the best, D being the weakest, and I'll also be ranking them within each tier. So for example, the top tiers in each rank will be on the far left, compared to the weakest units within that tier on the far right. So with that being said, let's get started. Let's talk about Atreides to start things off. So we start with the Trooper. Now the Trooper, in my opinion, is a C tier unit. Its basic role in any composition really is to tank. It has lower DPS than the Harkonnen Trooper. So for that reason, I would say it's better served as just a pure tank. It's there just to soak up as much damage as you can get. I would say you probably want about 2 or 3 of these units within each composition. Any more than that, I think they're just a waste of command points, which are limited in this game. But they serve their purpose. They are a little bit tankier than the Harkonnen Trooper. And absolutely they serve their purpose. They are a bit better than some of the other units in this game, but I would say they're sort of bottom of the rung. They're not that great, to be honest, but they absolutely serve their purpose. Next up, we've got the Atreides Ranger. Now the Atreides Ranger, I'm gonna have to put them as a B tier unit. They are basically the middle of the road DPS unit. They are by far the best DPS unit within House Atreides for the most part, excluding maybe the Heavy Gunner, which is also up there. I'd say their primary function is just to do as much damage as possible. Now they do also have a like a benefit in that they've got this ability called Focus Fire. So for every Ranger unit within the squad, you gain an extra, whatever target they're targeting, they gain 5% extra damage from all sources. Well, they take an extra 5% damage. So if you get about 5 of these units in your squad, you're going to do an extra 25% damage to whatever you're focus firing down. So they are genuinely pretty good. But again, they're just middle of the road. There's nothing that really makes them stand out from the crowd. They're good. They're just good DPS units, but there's nothing really that kind of makes them stand out like a lot of units in this game. So for that reason, they're just a B tier unit. And I have to be honest, with Atreides, a lot of their units are just middle of the road. There's nothing really special about them. So for that reason, they are going to be scored as such. That being said, I think the The heavy gunner unit, or the heavy weapons squad, I think is also a BT unit. I can't really say they're much better than Rangers. They certainly have a different job than the Ranger. The Ranger is there just to kill your enemies. Whereas the heavy weapons squad is there to shred armor. Not only are they there to shred armor, but they're also there to create AoE. So all of their attacks kind of hit not only whatever you're targeting, but a radius around those targets. So for that reason, they are actually pretty good. It's worth definitely having a couple of these in your squad. But yeah, there's nothing. They are probably the most unique unit within Atreides, but I wouldn't exactly say they are incredible. They kind of just do their job really well. And, you know, they are actually genuinely good at taking down main bases because of their armor shred. So next up, we've got the support drone, D tier. I mean, so basically the whole premise of these things are when they're fighting in a squad, if one or two of your units are injured, as in they die, they get picked up by the support drone instead of dying, and then you can airlift them back to base and heal them up, which is useful to a degree, but in actual like practicality, when there's lots going on and you're using large armies, they're actually really useless. They cost command points, they cost fuel cells, and they're just not that good. They really are not that good at all. Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to say anything more about them, really. They're just there, and they're not that good at all. So yeah, D tier for me. Now the Warden is definitely better than... They are definitely better than the Trooper. Their main role is not to deal damage, because they are really quite weak when it comes to damage. Their main role is like the next level up of tanking from the Trooper. So they are a B tier unit. I think that's fair to say. However, they just don't really do much other than tank. Like, their whole premise is to tank damage, and they do that really well. They are more armored than the Executioner, which is the Harkonnen version. But that's it. There's nothing more to them. They don't really do a huge amount of damage. And there's nothing really that makes them stand out. I suppose the only other benefit they have is that all allied units around them gain a +2 armor. So they do also support the rest of your squad in terms of tankiness. But again, I think that's the problem with Atreides. Atreides being like a very B tier faction, there's nothing really that stands out from the crowd. They're just kind of okay at best. They do everything you'd want them to do, but they don't do anything particularly well. They don't excel at anything. They're just that kind of tick the box as being, yes, they're good, yes, they can do it, and you know, you can win quite handily with Atreides on the military side of things. But your main units are going to be troopers to start you out alongside rangers, and then as you gain access to more command points and access to 5k hegemony, that's when you want to build in your wardens and your heavy weapon squad. But again, you probably want to have 3 or 4 wardens in your army, ideally 5 rangers and maybe 2 or 3 heavy weapon squads. Anything else you probably want to just put either your guild units, or you want to be using your troopers. But that's it for House Atreides, boys and girls. They're just very middle of the road. Alright, next up, Harkonnen. Now Harkonnen is basically a more aggressive version of Atreides. So their trooper is the kind of same tier as the Atreides trooper. However, they sacrifice armor but gain power. So they basically do more damage. So they're a little bit more useful in the fight. But they're not quite as tanky. But honestly, when it comes to the fight, it's barely noticeable. Like, 1 armor doesn't really make a huge difference, but the extra power you get, you know, does help you knock down the enemy opponents quite a bit quicker. So, moving on to the gunner. Now, the gunner I really like. I think the gunner is better than the ranger. The gunner used to be broken, but obviously in the more recent patches with Ix and everything else and the changes to armory, they kind of lost a lot of their attack speeds, but they gained a lot of power in the sense that their attacks just hit harder. I will say that the gunner and the ranger are kind of on par with each other. I prefer the gunner just because it does a lot more. It does AoE damage, whereas the ranger doesn't. And in high numbers, the gunners actually do shred pretty well. They definitely have. They pack a bigger punch than the ranger, but they do attack slower. So that's the trade-off between the two. But essentially, they serve the same purpose. You kind of want 5 or 6 of these gunners in your squad. They are going to be your primary DPS dealers for the most part. Now, Cerberus. Cerberus are an interesting unit. Essentially, they are a lighter version of the Trooper. They have less health, but when you kill them, they kind of split into 2 other smaller units. I definitely say they're better than the support drone, but I wouldn't necessarily say they're as good as a Trooper. Ideally, you want the Troopers because they're tanky and they can take a couple of punches. Whereas the Cerberus unit really doesn't. They are... I wouldn't even call them glass cannons because they don't even do that much damage, to be honest. They're kind of just an annoying unit to deal with. But I wouldn't necessarily say they're great, to be honest. I would definitely rate the Trooper over the Cerberus units. In fact, I rarely bother with them. I just don't think they're that good, to be honest. Combat drone. I would say they are actually better than the Cerberus unit. Now, basically, these don't really do any damage, but what you can do is swarm with them. What you can do, they can self-destruct, essentially. So you can charge them in, the enemies will attack them, and they blow up in their faces, do a little bit of damage, if you upgrade them, of course. And they also... just basically weaken your opponents, and I believe they give you extra armor as well when they die. So surrounding troops, when they die, kind of give you an extra 2 armor for the squad. So they're actually genuinely pretty useful. Definitely worth having 1 or 2 units on the squad, but they're not that great. They also remove armor on enemy units. So again, just a D tier unit. Like, they're not that great. You could easily avoid them and still do really well, but they have their uses on the battlefield. Executioner. Now, they're basically a stronger version of the Warden, in my opinion. Again, they sacrifice a bit of armor, but they pack a bigger punch. The Executioners also have Bloodthirsty, so I think they lifesteal for the most part, or at least they heal. They have some sort of self-sustain. I actually think they are definitely better than the Warden. But again, I don't think they're that great. So I would call them a B tier unit. Definitely worth building into your army. And again, serves the same purpose as the Trooper, right? So the Trooper is there as an early game tank. And then as you progress through the game to the mid to late game, that's when you want to kind of transition into Executioners, and they basically just replace the Trooper, same as the Warden replaces the Trooper. So yeah, that's House Harkonnen. Overall, a lot stronger, higher DPS than the Atreides equivalents, but overall kind of just that middle of the road kind of units. There's nothing really that makes them really stand out or pop. They definitely don't have any of those A or S tier units that we'll be getting into shortly. Alright, so moving on to House Corrino, which is probably my favourite faction. Home to the Imperial Sardaukar, one of the best units in the game. Let's start, however, with the Conscript Swordsmen. Now, Conscript Swordsmen are easily better than the Troopers. the benefit of using conscript swordsmen is that they actually give armor to friendly units when you upgrade them. So not only are they genuinely quite tanky, they actually give armor to your friendly units, which is a massive buff. I will say they are weaker than the Harkonnen and Atreides troopers, just in terms of tankiness. So they are a little bit weaker in that regard. But the fact that they give you armor in close combat is actually pretty good. And in my opinion, it makes them slightly better. But they are still C tier units at the end of the day. Now, the Corrino rifleman or conscript rifleman, I would have to put as a B tier unit. Do you know what? Actually, I'd put them as C tier. I don't even think they're as good as the rifleman, and I don't think they're as good as... actually, I think they're better than the... Are they? No, I don't think they are. I think the rifleman is probably the weakest DPS dealer in the game. Pretty much. I mean, they serve a purpose, but they are so easily replaced by the incinerator. They're more of a... I see them more as an anti-air specialist unit. So unless you're going against someone who has anti-air, they're really not worth building into an army. I would say you're much better off getting the next unit we're going to talk about, which is the incinerator. Yeah, the conscript riflemen they don't pack as big a punch as the Atreides or the Harkonnen DPS units, the gunner and the rifleman. But in the same token, they do act as a little bit of DPS. I personally don't even use them in the early game. I completely just ignore this unit unless I'm against like the guild, I say renegade. So if I need to take out air units, or if the enemy is going for their own guild air units, then you'd probably want to build a couple of riflemen. They are pretty much the only unit aside from the artillery unit that actually shoots up. So that is what kind of you need for anti-air, but unless you're going against anti-air, I wouldn't even bother with them. Now, we move on to our first A tier unit, the Pyro, or the Incinerator, as they are officially called. Incinerators are genuinely amazing. They are actually tanky. They might not have a huge amount of armor, but they do have a big health pool. And the whole gimmick is they are AoE specialists. They basically burn down the enemy squad and they attack in a cone. So your goal is to basically move these up as close to the front line without being on the front line and aim at the enemy unit that's the furthest in the back. Once you do that, they just burn everything in their path. It's basically an AoE cone. You can actually increase it if you want. I actually think the burning damage and the dealing extra damage that you deal when enemies are burned are actually the armory upgrades to go for. But ultimately, they are just insane damage dealers. Like, they are so good. Definitely worth picking up as your main damage dealer for House Corrino. And they easily sit above pretty much all of the other units from House Atreides and House Harkonnen, in my opinion. Obviously, they 1v1, they're not going to beat a Warden or an Executioner. But, if you build your composition right, they'll never have to. So, moving on to the next unit from House Corrino, and that is the Artillery. Now, the Artillery is probably, in my opinion, an S tier unit. It's such a powerful unit. What makes this unit so great is its range. And once you get like 3 or 4 of them, they absolutely annihilate enemies from range. And especially with the way that Dune Spice Wars clumps up units, if you just get 3 or 4 of these, they can absolutely annihilate an entire squad of enemies before they even get to you, or at least weaken them to the point that your army can just clean house. They definitely have their weaknesses. Weaknesses include not being able to move very fast. They have to set up before they attack, and they cannot attack at close range. So if you are to attack an enemy, you need to make sure you take down any airports before you take, siege a village. If you've got artillery units like near the village, they will literally just land units on top of your artillery. The other problem is they do also attract spice worms when they set up. So you need to be a little bit mindful of where you're positioning your artillery units. Because if you kind of put them in a weird position, they will absolutely get ganked. And also, if you set them up and it's next to a spice worm, or a spice worm gets triggered, they will literally, there's no escape really, unless you're very close to some concrete. So yeah, but damage wise, huge, absolutely huge DPS. If you can get 5 or 6 of these in your squad, yeah, good luck trying to stop it. An ideal squad for Corrino is probably about 4 or 5 artillery units, 3, maybe 4 Sardaukar, and the rest in pyros or incinerators. And that is a good luck stopping that kind of squad, because it is seriously strong, as long as you control it well. But yeah, that's how I rate the artillery unit. A very, very strong unit, definitely worth including in your army. Something I probably didn't appreciate until much later in my Corrino campaign, just how strong the artillery is. And then playing against Corrino as Ecaz, I realized just how busted this unit really is. It is worth noting as well, and fun fact, the artillery units are the only units that can outrange a main base. So let's say, for argument's sake, you were to own a village or capture a village that was next to an enemy main base. You can use it as a staging site, basically, with 4 or 5 artillery, just to set them up next to the base so they can heal. And they can literally just shell the enemy main base from afar, and they can't do anything to stop you. The only thing they can do is send an army. If you have incinerator units and Sardaukar next to those artillery units, you're not going to stop them. It's just, it is almost a guaranteed victory if you can get 4 or 5 artillery units sieged up against an enemy main base. Like, it is really difficult to stop. Not only that, they do huge DPS, and any units that come out of that main base, if they're just on hold position, they'll literally just half health them or destroy them in one volley before they even get to you. So it's like, okay, well, the only real way of stopping them is to airdrop a huge army on top of them. That's the best way to deal with artillery. But yeah, I appreciate we've been spending quite a lot of time talking about the artillery unit, but they are just easily an S tier unit. But they do have their weaknesses. You have to take their weaknesses into account, otherwise, they can very quickly come from an S tier unit to a C tier unit. Anywho, moving on to the Imperial Sardaukar. Now, Sardaukar, again, S tier unit. I think they are the second best unit in this game, second only to the Fedaykin, the Fremen Fedaykin. Now, what makes this Sardaukar so good? They're tanky, they've got a strong health pool, and they execute units below 20% HP. 20% is a big amount of health to just execute and just insta-kill. It's worth noting it doesn't work on heroes. And it's also worth noting that if you get Captain Aramsham, he actually increases the threshold, the execute threshold, even further. You can also upgrade the Sardaukar to, when they execute, to give you 5 influence. Now, if you're just going around clearing up militia and you're executing enemies left, right, and center and gaining 5 influence every single time, it's actually insane. Like, Sardaukar are so strong. They are such a good unit. I would probably put them somewhere on par with the Fremen Fedaykin. I think the Fedaykin are maybe slightly better, but we will get to them a little bit later on in this video. So overall, I think House Corrino is probably one of the strongest factions from a unit perspective. And the three units really that really make them stand out is the Sardaukar, the artillery, and the incinerators. Those are all the units you really need. The only thing you do need earlier in the game is just the conscript swordsman. In fact, I'd actually put this conscript swordsman, in hindsight, probably below the 2 trooper units. I think that's a little bit more fair, just because they are weaker overall. It's just they can give armor to allied units, which I think is actually quite good to rate them on, but grand scheme of things, they are weaker. They're not as tanky, they have less health, and they don't do really as much damage as the 2 troopers. But you know, I think that kind of that is the balance really. And to be honest, you just need 1 or 2 of those in the early game. The rest are incinerator units. Unless you're going against air, I wouldn't even bother with riflemen, and then you just fill out your army with artillery and Sardaukar. That's the way to go. I would say, just to reiterate, I would say maybe 3 or 4 Sardaukar max. You probably, any more is kind of like overkill and unnecessary. I'd say 4 or 5 artillery, and then max out the rest of your army with incinerators. And if you're against air, to pick out a couple of maybe 1 or 2 riflemen. And that really is an almost unbeatable army from House Corrino. Also, another fun fact with the artillery: if you were to capture, well, not capture, but liberate a village that's next to an enemy main base, and then drop an Imperial main base there, and then airdrop your entire army, including artillery, into the Imperial base, you will absolutely decimate pretty much any army or anything that an enemy can throw at you. Bar maybe a Fremen or a Ecaz maxed army. I think a Harkonnen and an Atreides would struggle to deal with that. Almost certainly, like, the incinerator units would just absolutely decimate them, their troops. Again, especially it's just the way that units kind of group in this game. They like to, like, bind together whenever you issue move commands. But yeah, just a little fun fact, another thing that just makes House Corrino completely, I wouldn't say overpowered, but very dominating in PvP, campaign, whatever, take your pick. They are a very dominating faction, and probably my favourite faction in the game. Moving on to perhaps my second favourite faction next though, House Ecaz. Now Ecaz really took me by surprise because I thought their units were going to be okay at best. They really surprised me at just how powerful their units actually are. So let's start with the Squire. Now the Squire is again like the Ecaz equivalent of the Trooper. However, the Squire again offers tankiness or armor to units in close combat when you upgrade them. They're also very tanky. They have 7 armor, more armor than any other like tier 1 unit. They actually have more armor than a Knight, which is the unit that technically replaces them. Do they actually replace them though, is the question. And this is actually a hard one for me to rank. I would either say they are the best C tier unit or the weakest B tier unit. They are somewhere in between, because I would actually rate them as highly as a Warden, maybe more than a Warden. Obviously their role is not to do DPS, and that's, you know, they're not DPS units, but they're neither are Wardens, and yet Wardens have a little bit more health, they have a little bit more armor. Do you know what? I would actually call them a B tier unit. I definitely think it's fair to say you can't really call them as good as Executioners or as good as Wardens. But in terms of the role that they play, I would say Squires are one of the best units for Ecaz, just to mix in the army throughout the whole game. I would even say the replacement Knight is probably not as good as a squire because they're not as tanky. In fact, it's worth having 1 or 2 knights to actually buff the squire in terms of its armor, and it actually makes them stronger. It actually gives them up to like 8 armor. Anyway, more on that when we get to the knight. But yeah, squire I think is like the weakest B tier unit because it's not supposed to be a B tier unit, but it is. It's like, it's just that good. Now moving on to the fencer. Oh no, sorry, this is the musketeer. The musketeer, I think, is the best A tier unit in the game. Maybe. Definitely up there. Now the musketeer without upgrades, yeah, I think it's fair to say is probably a top end B tier unit. Probably somewhere ahead of the warden and the executioner. Purely in terms of DPS. Like they are the crux of the DPS dealer for House Ecaz. Like these are 80 to 85% of your army. 75 to 80%, let's not get too carried away. 75 to 80% of your army should be musketeers. And if they're not, you're probably playing Ecaz wrong, in my opinion. Musketeers are just a firing squad. You get an upgrade that does double damage on the first attack, so long as they're at max health. And they stay in the back line anyway, so they're never really going to be taking damage unless you're microing them poorly, or unless you get flanked or ambushed. So I believe that armory upgrade is only supposed to kick in for the first attack in combat. However, I don't know if it's a bug or what, but it kicks in every single attack and they just become this firing squad. You get 8 or 9 musketeers in your army with that upgrade. You will shred any enemy that comes, anything. I'm talking artillery units, I'm talking Sardaukar, I'm talking Fredaken, I'm talking executioners, wardens, gunners. You take your pick. Squires, whatever you target with 8 or 9 musketeers will die in one volley. You will one-tap pretty much anything in the game. And that is what makes musketeers so good and an A-tier unit in my opinion. I think that the incinerators, or pyros as I call them, they are on par. They are on par. Their role is very different. They are the damage dealer, but the way they do damage is very different. They are like an AoE damage dealer, similar to the heavy weapon squad. They're just so much more effective at doing it. However, the musketeer is just an absolute DPS dealer, an absolute DPS monster. You can literally just target one enemy dead, target the next enemy dead, target the next enemy dead, and you just wipe out an entire army like that. Obviously, they do have the same sort of debuffs if you do manage to get in range with them. So that is their weakness, is you just want to make sure that they're not getting in range in close combat with any enemies. Otherwise, they'll lose half of their damage and they'll lose their buff from the armory upgrade. Anywho, moving on to the Fencer. Now, the Fencer is an interesting unit. I'd call it somewhere between a top-end D tier or a low-end C tier. They have a very, very specific purpose on the battlefield, and that is to... They are a DPS dealer. You can give them armor, and you can give them like the most insane movement speed. So for that reason, when fully upgraded, I would say a Fencer is probably a low-end C tier unit. I don't think it's as good as the Riflemen. I definitely don't think they're anywhere near as good as Gunners or Rangers. But they serve a purpose on the battlefield. I rarely run them, but I definitely see the benefit of having maybe 1 or 2 of these mixed into your army, especially if you're running into, let's say, artillery. These things can be really good just to like run in, avoid the bulk of the enemy forces, and then just target the artillery, so the artillery are forced to like unsiege. I mean, artillery are very much like siege tanks in StarCraft, right? If you get in close range combat with them, they're going to have to unsiege, or you know, they start getting loads of debuffs basically. Obviously in this game it's a little bit more savage in the sense that they will not fire at close range, similar to the siege tank. But siege tanks will just continue to fire, whereas these things, artillery, yeah, you kind of have to like micro them out of that. But yeah, I think fences, they serve a purpose. You know, you can get them in the back line very easily, very efficiently. You can get them to have +5 armor if you choose that upgrade. I think they're okay, but you can easily just avoid picking these units. I definitely think they're better than the D tier units we have by a mile. But I definitely don't think they're anything better than C tier or low end C tier. War banners are an interesting unit. What they do is give all friendly units inspiration, which gives +20% DPS, +20% damage. It's a flat upgrade. Now you can only have that once, it doesn't stack, but it's worth having maybe 1 or 2 of these mixed into your army. You can also upgrade them so when enemies attack your war banner, they take an additional 20% damage. So let's say you've got artillery units that they're targeting these war banners, or any unit. Let's say they'll take 20% extra damage. All your units will get inspired +20% damage. They give you an army a 40% damage swing. That is insane if you couple them with musketeers. So for that reason, they do attack as well. I mean, they're very limited attack. They're very tanky. They have a high health pool, and they have a decent amount of armor as well. I'd have to say the war banner, because of its uniqueness, is a high B tier unit. Now they're not, obviously 1v1, they're not going to do anything to an executioner or a warden or a gun or anything like that. So in that regard, yeah, they're definitely not, you know, they're not going to hold a candle. But for what they do, what they bring, the amount of increased DPS you can gain by having just 1 or 2 of these war banners mixed into your army is insane. You should definitely be using at least 1, probably 2 mixed into your army, and just watch how much damage those musketeers do with those upgrades. I guarantee you'll be one-shotting everything. It's, yeah, with 8 or 9 musketeers and a war banner unit, and just the rest have squires and 1 knight. That's all you need. Talking of knights, I would say these knights are actually... Is that too harsh? No, I don't think it is. I think they are the worst B tier units. They're definitely not C tier. They are definitely B tier. They are better than troopers for sure. They're better than the conscript riflemen. They're easily better than fencers. But I think the squire is a better tank than the knight. I've played quite a few games with Ecaz, and I have to say the squires did a much better job. However, the knights do still have a use. Now, knights, when you upgrade them, can give squires additional armor. They are also good at doing DPS, so you can get them so they ignore half of enemy armor. So they kind of, similar to squires, they serve a purpose on the battlefield, but they have a different role. The role of having 1 or 2 knights mixed in is it makes the squires tankier. The squires are the tanks for the house Ecaz, whereas when you compare that to like executioners and wardens, those are the tank units. The knight doesn't kind of act in the same way that those executioners and wardens do, so they are a very different unit, and they're more DPS, so they actually do more damage than a warden or a executioner, but they are a little bit glass cannony in that regard. Like they don't tank main bases very well at all. In fact, they get absolutely slaughtered. But they do a lot of damage to main bases, so, you know, swings and roundabouts. I will say it is definitely worth having 1 or 2 mixed into your army. And then there is also the 2 added benefits with House Ecaz as a faction. The first benefit is that all units can become pristine units by spending more manpower when you create them, which gives them a small power buff over the conventional units. So you could almost have the same units twice and just be slightly better. Also with House Ecaz, trying to think what the other one was now. I'm drawing a blank. Oh, they can become. You can create champions. So, for example, you can have 1 or 2 champions in your army, which is basically a better version of that unit. You can create a musketeer as a champion. You can create a squire as a champion. You can create a knight as a champion, and those units are very, very strong. Massive health pool, a lot more tanky than the original versions. Obviously we don't really, it's difficult to put a champion unit in here because it's not really a unit, it's more of a unit upgrade. And there's one other benefit as well with House Ecaz, and that is one of their champions, not champions, one of their councillors can make it so that all of your units start at level 2, which is actually insane. Like, it's completely busted. I don't know if that's a campaign only thing, but I'm pretty sure it's available in PvP. But that is an insane councillor to literally have all your units start as level 2 units. Like, completely busted. Maybe I'll do like a councillor tier list sometime in the future. If that's something you're interested, let me know in the comments section. Also, just let me know if you like agree with what I'm saying. I appreciate these are my thoughts, my personal opinions. And, you know, some people may be like, no way. But I'd be curious to see what you think anyway in the comments section below. Alright, moving on to the weakest faction in the game, certainly from a unit's perspective. House Ix. Man, these guys. Ooh. So House Vernius of Ix was the first DLC faction. It's the latest faction to land. I'm sure as time goes on they will have their units buffed. But as it stands right now and as the time of recording, their units are glass cannons. Literal glass cannons. So, with that in mind, let's start with the fighting mech. Now, the fighting mech, it's hard to... They are a C tier unit, for sure. I think they are better than the conscripts. They are arguably as good as, if not slightly better than, the troopers. But also they don't level up. Not in a traditional way. They also cost Solari to recruit rather than manpower. They also have an upkeep cost when repairing of Solari rather than manpower. So for that reason, the fact that they are relatively tanky. They do have 7 armor, which is pretty good. That does make them a little bit more tanky than the troopers. The health pool's not too bad, and they can be repaired. So when you factor everything in, yeah, these guys are slightly better than troopers. In fact, I am going to put them as slightly better than troopers, because once you kind of round them out with the units, once you kind of get the field engineers added into the army, fighting mechs become a lot stronger. You can also upgrade them in pretty cool ways where they do plus 20% damage to organic units. You can also give them more armor when tethered. So yeah, I mean, you can also make them cost more fuel cells and have plus 2 armor. So I would say the fighting mechs are pretty good units overall. I think they are the sort of the best of the C tiers. They're definitely not a B tier unit. They're not bad. They are your tanks. They are your baseline tanks, equivalents to your troopers, but they are slightly better, and they do actually work really well late game. I think early to mid game, before you get your field engineers out, they're okay. I'd say they're worse than the troopers. But once you kind of get into that sort of mid to late game, I think they do kind of become a little bit better. So for that reason, I am putting them ahead of the trooper units. Oh my boy, suboid soldiers. Oh my Christ. If there was an E tier, I would put them in E tier. I would literally rather have a support drone in my army than a bloody suboid soldier. These things are shit. They are so bad. I mean, I will give them 1 ounce of credit in that they are very fast moving. So when you can, they can sort of get to the back line really quickly. And to be fair, they are more useful. They're more useful than the support drone. The support drone is just, it doesn't really serve any purpose in the game. I think if you just took that unit out of the game, it would make no difference to House Atreides whatsoever. The Suboid at least does damage. At least it does something in the fight. They are fast. You can get around the enemies. They're a little bit like fences in that regard. You can sort of get them into sort of melee combat with rangers and you know, gunners and all that good stuff, but they're not great. They're really, really not great. They are glass cannons. You look at them funny and they die. They are very cheap. They're 20 manpower. They're the only manpower cost unit. That's a lie. They're one of the only manpower cost units for Ecaz, the other being the field engineer. You can buff them so that they kind of buff your ally units as well with a little bit of extra power. But they are rubbish. Let's not beat around the bush here. They are really bottom tier, bottom D tier units. They're crap. They really are rubbish. But, you know, there's a very small use for them on the battlefield, I suppose. Railgun drones. Now, these are actually quite difficult for me. I'd say Ecaz in general are actually pretty difficult for me to place, because they are such glass cannons. They do a reasonable amount of damage. I'm just making one change as well. I'm actually going to put the heavy weapon squad ahead of the gunners and the rangers. I actually think they are slightly better. You don't need as many of them, but the armor shred is actually really useful. I'm just thinking about this as we go along. I think that's the right place for them. Railgun drones, though. Man. I mean, they are technically better than Squires. They're DPS dealers. You can attack at long range when tethered. They don't have supply costs. That's another benefit of drones. This is where I'm thinking. I don't think they're as good as gunners. I'm almost reluctant to put them ahead of rangers, to be honest. But they do a fair amount of damage. But you so much as look at a railgun drone the wrong way and it will just implode. I might have to come back to the railgun drone. I'm finding it hard to place them. Obviously you can repair them as well. So if you repair them on the fly with the field engineer, that kind of makes them okay. Yeah, I think that's pretty much where we're going to have to put the railgun drone. High DPS, long range, very, very weak. No supply cost, so you can literally run them around the map, picking up bits and bobs, which does make them slightly better than a squad, like a troop, any kind of ranger, gun or anything like that. But I begrudge putting them any higher. Even though DPS wise I'd say they do more damage than a gunner. Yeah, I think that's where they sit. Resonance drones. I think resonance drones are slightly better than railgun drones. They are the tank. Them and the fighting mechs are the two tanks of this faction. Both can tank a main base if they have to. The resonance drones at least kind of does damage. The fighting mech kind of doesn't really. It's very limited damage. But all of the drones can be repaired. And that's the thing that's making it really difficult for me to place them, because On their own, standalone, these units are really bad. But when you kind of mix them in with the engineers, it kind of changes the way that those units work. And for that reason, I kind of have to say that the engineers are pretty good. And the engineers are kind of what's making these units better than they actually are, because they can heal them in combat, which is unlike any other faction. None of the other factions can really heal in combat. Not in the way that Ecaz can. Plus, none of their drones cost supplies, which is also a big buff. All of their drone units cost Solari rather than manpower, so come sort of mid to late game, you can absolutely power up very quickly and replace these units very well. But that's also a hindrance in the early game, like not being able to use Solari for other things is a bit of a challenge. And then we've got the field engineer, which is a very interesting unit. It's a very interesting unit because it doesn't really tank in its own right, has very limited DPS. They're a must-have for this faction. You need to have at least 1 or 2 of these units mixed in your army. They basically transfer their experience level onto your drones. So drones themselves don't actually gain experience in this game. However, when you get like a level 2, level 3 or level 4 fight engineer, he transfers all of his experience onto surrounding drones. So then your resonance drones, your railgun drones, your fighting mechs become level 4 drones, which give them buffs, basically. Makes them tankier, makes them harder to kill, makes them have higher DPS. You can also upgrade these fighting engineers so they gain +3 armor whilst they're healing, which is huge. But in their own right, they're definitely not as good as war banners, even though they're more impactful than war banners. Arguably. Arguably. I think they are slightly better than a Warden Executioner. I genuinely think they are better. They're more impactful in a fight. The War Banner is better, but in a completely different way. They're definitely not A tier. They're definitely not C tier. They deserve to be a B tier unit. Their role isn't DPS, their role is healing, and they do that very well. In fact, with 1 or 2 of these mixed in, especially if they're leveled up, they can actually out-heal the damage from a main base if you've got a resonant drone or a fighting drone or fighting mech tanking. And it's an AoE heal. It is what it is, boys. I've got to put it at B tier and I've got to put it at high B tier because it is a strong unit. Even though it's not really designed for fighting, even though it's called a fighting engineer. That's not its role in the game. So yeah, that concludes Ix really. They don't really have anything that really stands out. They don't... Similar to Atreides, I would say. They're a very middle of the road faction, but they're very glass cannon-y. Very glass cannon-y. They're very intricate. Requires a huge amount of micro to be effective in combat. I would have to say they are my least favourite faction when it comes to fighting main bases. Even though they can be quite effective at doing so. But they don't hold a candle to Ecaz or Corrino, in my opinion. Alright. Moving on to Scavengers next. Now, it is worth noting that I haven't put half as much time into Scavengers and Fremen as these other factions. So my experience and knowledge is a little bit more limited with these two factions. That being said, I've played against them enough times. I have put a few hours into them from a skirmish perspective. And I have a relatively good understanding of how their units work and what their upgrades are. So with that in mind, and again, please feel free to correct me if you think I'm misplacing these in the comment section below. It'd be really good to have a discussion on this. But this is what I think. I think the Scavengers sit here. Better than a swordsman, but not as good as the troopers. I think they're kind of the middle of the road of the C tier units. Like, they're not bad at all, but they're not great either. I think the troopers do a better job of tanking, which is what their primary role is within this faction, right? And the fighting mech can be repaired, which makes it even better than perhaps it should be. And that's where I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it at that. So, is this the sniper? So we've got these the wrong way around. So I'm going to put that there. So the Wrecker is next. Now the Wrecker is basically a gas lobbing grenadier, essentially, as a DPS dealer. It has AoE damage. Does a lot of damage. Has dot damage, because the gas lingers. It's a really good ranged unit. A really good ranged unit. For that reason, I'm going to say they're better than the heavy weapon squad and the gunners. They are a top B tier unit in my opinion. They do a lot of damage. I've lost a lot of fights against these damn things. Yes, you can get into melee range with them and it kind of messes them up a little bit, but if they're just there in the back line free casting their gas grenades, your army's going to disappear very fast. That's where I think they deserve to be. Next up we have the sniper. Now the sniper is a very, very powerful unit. Very high DPS. It's invisible to anything other than close range, I think, unless you've got one of those intel monitoring stations. High DPS. I think it does like an extra 30% damage to organic life forms, which is pretty much most of the troops, excluding Ecaz for the most part. How can this be anything other than an A tier unit? Do I think they're better than incinerators? Arguably. Arguably. But I think their function is basically high DPS, and they do that extraordinarily well. Single target DPS granted. These are kind of like the bulk of the forces. You kind of want, ideally in your army, you want a couple of free companies, like 3 or 4. I think you want 2 or 3 wreckers, and the rest are snipers. That's how I think it should be. I think that's right. I think that's fair. They are definitely up there in A tier. They're not quite S tier units. They're definitely better than B tier. I mean, invisibility, right? I mean, it's just such a powerful... Like, stealth in any game is a very strong mechanic. But for a ranged unit like a sniper that does high DPS, can't be anything other than A tier, boys. Scavenging drone. This is a unit that's very much on par with the support drone, in my opinion. It has a use on the battlefield. Essentially, you have it in your army, and for every unit that dies, I think it's allied unit as well specifically, it loots the armor and gives your units a bit of a buff, up to 10 times. I think it's like 2% power and 2% armor or something. Might not even be armor, it's 2% something, I can't remember for the life of me, but it gives you a very small incremental power buff. You times it by 10, so if you lose 10 troops, it gives you an extra 20% power. It's okay. Like, it serves more of a purpose than a support drone. I'd say it's less impactful than a Suboid soldier. Kind of. Yeah, I think that's fair. And then we've got the Free Company. Now, the Free Company is not a unit I've played a huge amount. I've played against Scavengers enough to kind of get a feel for their units. And I feel like these units are okay at best. Like, they're definitely a B tier unit, for sure. Where do they sit in B tier? I don't think they're as impactful as a War Banner. I definitely don't think they're as impactful as a Combat Engineer. So then the question becomes, are they more impactful than an Executioner or a Warden? They are a tank unit. That's kind of their role. I think they're higher DPS than the two, than the Executioner and Wardens, but I don't think they're quite as tanky. So for that reason, I'm going to put them here because they do serve a purpose. I think they're impactful. But I don't think... I think I'd rather have the Executioner or the Warden tanking for me than the extra DPS I gain from the Free Company. And again, this is not with a huge amount of playtime with these guys. So I could be way off base here, but that's... Personally, that's how I feel they fit into this tier list. And then we end with the final faction, House Fremen, the natives of Arrakis. And we'll start with their Worry unit. They're not bad. They're not bad. I would actually say they are better than Troopers. I think they're much higher DPS than Troopers. They're maybe not quite as tanky. But they also, I'm pretty sure they either debuff the enemy or buff your own troops. I'm pretty sure it's a debuff. I think it's like a 10% debuff on power to enemies. It might even be 15% actually, from memory. I remember them being pretty strong. I don't think they're as good as a fighting mech because fighting mechs can be healed in combat. But I do think they are better than the other kind of C tier units on this list. And then we have Infiltrators. Now, Infiltrators are a very interesting unit. So they're stealth units. Very high DPS. But they are melee. They're almost like assassins. You can upgrade them to be more like assassins as well. They are very fast units. They're definitely better than Fencers for sure. I think they are a B tier unit. I think that's where they sit. I think they sit between the heavy weapon squad, the gunners, the railgun drones. Yeah, they are a middle of the road B tier unit, high damage. The stealth is the thing, right? Because stealth could even like push them higher up this list, but I'm not sure. because they are quite weak. They're kind of glass cannons in that regard, but the thing is, a glass cannon railgun drone at least has range, whereas these things don't. So it's harder to get their DPS off. But they can stealth. So if they didn't have stealth, I'd say they're kind of down here, down by the squire. But with stealth, I think that's where they sit, sort of between these two, the gunner and the heavy weapon squad. That's where I'm putting them. I think they are good. They're good assassin type units. Right, next units. Ooh, this is a tricky unit to replace. Skirmisher. Now the skirmisher. This is not a unit I've played a huge amount, to be honest. I believe it's their ranged unit. See, without playing this unit a huge amount, I'm really struggling where to put this one. I think I'm going to have to put them ahead of the ranger, but below the railgun drone. I've not really played this unit enough to really know where it sits in this tree. So feel free to correct me in the comments section if you think I've butchered that one. And that's fair. That very well may well be the case. I just haven't put a huge amount of hours into House Fremen. That being said, when I've played against them, I've kind of thought they're okay. Better than a ranger, okay. But I found the railgun drones more annoying to deal with than these guys. I think that's where I'm going to have to put them. The mobile turret. What a weird unit. So this is an anti-air platform, essentially, that you can move around. Oddly specific. I don't think it even attacks ground. I could be wrong. But it does butcher air units. So if you do want to take down air units, these things are pretty good. Is it D tier? I think it's D tier. I think it's the best of the D tier units. No, I can't do that. The fence is in C, so that this has to be in C as well. It's the worst of the C tier units. It's very specific in what it's trying to do. It takes down air units, takes down ornithopters, which is quite useful. It's very effective at taking down renegade air units. If your enemy's going mass air, it's a good unit against it. But other than that, it's kind of like it's kind of a meh unit. I think that's where it's gonna have to go. And then we have the Fremen Fdakin. Arguably the strongest unit in the game. Definitely up there with Sardaukar. Definitely up there with Sardaukar and the artillery. Can ride worms. I believe. Extremely strong units. 1v1 they will beat pretty much anything, including a Sardaukar, even with the execution. Tanky. Fast. Decent health pool. Very high DPS. They'll pretty much 1v1 anything. Is it better than Sardaukar? I think think it's better than Sardaukar. Slightly better than Sardaukar. Personally, I think Sardaukar have more utility in a fight, but I think the Fremen for Dakin are the best units in the game. They'll 1v1 anything. And they are the elite warriors of Arrakis. And there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. That is my complete tier list for Dune Spice Wars. My thoughts on why they are where they are. Now, I appreciate not everyone's going to agree with me with this, and this is personal opinion based on my experience of the game. Again, it's worth pointing out I haven't put a huge amount of hours into Fremen or Scavengers. A lot of this is based on what I've played against them and the few hours that I've put into them in skirmishes. So take that with a pinch of salt. But that is how I see Dune Spice Wars. I think House Corrino is the best faction in terms of everything that it has. It has the most high tier units in the game. And the 3 S tier, well, the 2 S tier units and the 1 A tier units is really all you need. I think Ecaz has the best ranged unit in the game with the Musketeer. It is so powerful. Bar maybe the artillery, I suppose. And the Scavengers have the snipers, which is on par. The War Banner's huge. Icks are weak as hell, but they do have the Fight Engineer, which makes that entire faction better. Without that Fight Engineer, Icks is just like C tier at best. With the Fight Engineer, they've got a couple of B tier units. And then House Harkonnen and Atreides are very middle of the road, and they're very much on par with each other. Like, I feel like Atreides and Harkonnen were very much designed with each other in mind. Like, their units are basically identical for the most part. They just have very slightly different uses on the battlefield. Harkonnen's a lot more aggressive, as they should be. They lose armor, but they gain power. Atreides is like the more defensible version. But the heavy weapon squad does make them slightly better because of the armor shred. So, but the gunner's also better than the ranger. So, yeah. So yeah, I mean, as I say, from my opinion, Corrino is my favourite faction. I think they have the best units. Ecaz is my second favourite faction. Then I think you've got to go Fremen in terms of strength. Scavengers next. Harkonnen, Atreides, Icks. That's how I rate them in terms of unit strength and utility. So that'll right about do it for me, folks. Thank you all so very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do give it a thumbs up. If this is the kind of content you enjoy, then please do consider subscribing to the channel. It does help support the channel and would be greatly appreciated. If you want to see more content like this, do let me know in the comment section below. Let me know what you thought, whether you agree with my comments, whether you disagree with them. Let's have a discussion. Let me know in the comment section below what you thought. And as always, I shall see you in the next video.